Hi, I'm Bill Glahn with Center of the American Experiment, here to talk about Feeding Our Future, a scandal involving a formerly obscure Minnesota nonprofit. On January 20th, 2022, 200 law enforcement personnel, led by the FBI, conducted a series of searches around the metro area, involving 3 different search warrants. A total of 15 locations were searched, including private homes, office buildings, and retail stores. The FBI alleges that fraud against 2 U.S. government programs involving free food for children were conducted on an industrial scale by these organizations and involved the loss of $48 million in taxpayer money. The dollar amounts involved are staggering. The lead nonprofit was Feeding Our Future, run by its founder, Amy Bach. It took in $245 million from these free food programs in the 6 years that it existed. Another nonprofit, Partners in Nutrition, also known as Partners in Quality Care, took in $215 million over the same period. A third nonprofit, not named in any of the search warrants, called Youth Leadership Academy, also known as Gargar Family Services, took in $24 million in just the first few months that it existed. What did these $500 million buy? Well, according to the proponents of these programs, these nonprofits distributed hundreds of millions of meals at hundreds of locations around the metro area through dozens of nonprofits, some of whom were recently incorporated just for this purpose. These 3 nonprofits acted as sponsors, coordinating efforts between the distribution sites and the state and federal agencies that ran the free food programs. In exchange, these sponsor nonprofits took a 10% fee right off the top. The government agencies involved at the state level included the Minnesota Department of Education. At the federal level, these programs were run by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. In fact, these are federal programs authorized by Congress. The Child and Adult Care Program operates mostly through child care facilities, churches, and schools, and is meant to provide food for after-school care and for preschoolers during what would be the school day. The FBI claims that $48 million from these free food programs was diverted to pay for homes, lakeside lots, luxury vacations, automobiles, and other spending not at all related to feeding hungry children. $80,000 on a Silverado. How do you spend $80,000 on a pickup truck? These 2 federal programs reimburse participants between $1 and $4 per meal. So to get up to $500 million in spending on these programs, that represents hundreds of millions of meals distributed to Minnesota school children. The FBI raids took place at 15 locations around the metro area. 3055 Old Highway 8 is an office building located in St. Anthony, Minnesota. It's the headquarters of Feeding Our Future. Coincidentally, it's also the headquarters of 2 other free food nonprofits that still operate in the program, but are unaffiliated with Feeding Our Future. 3055 Old Highway 8 was formerly the Medtronic headquarters until that company moved to a campus elsewhere in the metro area. 2722 Park Avenue is a Victorian mansion located in South Minneapolis. It's the headquarters of the Safari Restaurant and related entities. The property includes an adjacent office building and a surface parking lot that take up almost an entire city block. The Uptown Office Park is the headquarters for a number of entities controlled by an individual who both worked for Feeding Our Future but also ran unrelated entities on the side through which money was funneled. Court documents say that this individual may have fled the country since the scandal broke. 309 Lake Street is a storefront in a series of buildings on the 300 block of Lake Street in South Minneapolis. It's the headquarters of S&S Catering Company, who is named in one of the search warrants in the scandal, as well as a number of related entities owned by the same individuals. The day after the FBI raids took place in January, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Minnesota filed a lawsuit in federal court seeking to have forfeited 14 properties. Of these 14 properties, 2 are located in Kentucky and 12 are located here in Minnesota. The U.S. Attorney for Minnesota claims that these 14 properties were acquired with the ill-gotten gains of the Feeding Our Future scandal. The 2722 Park Avenue address mentioned earlier was purchased by figures in the Safari Restaurant Group for a price of $2.8 million just last year. As mentioned before, it includes an adjacent office building and a large surface parking lot. The 309 Lake Street address was part of a two-building complex purchased for $4.8 million last year by figures behind the S&S Catering Company. This former restaurant in Brooklyn Park was purchased for $1 million last fall by, again, figures behind the Safari Restaurant Group. As the name suggests, it's located near the Edinburgh Golf Club in Brooklyn Park. The restaurant closed as a result of the pandemic lockdowns in the last couple of years. It was not at all associated with the Feeding Our Future scandal and never participated in any of the free food programs. The site is currently vacant. Not mentioned in the forfeiture lawsuit are a number of other properties acquired allegedly with the ill-gotten gains of the Feeding Our Future scandal. These include other homes as well as properties overseas, specifically in Kenya. So the scandal revolves around 3 free food networks, each run by a different nonprofit company. But under Feeding Our Future and Partners in Nutrition, there were 3 food vendors who feature prominently in the story. This is the Safari restaurant in South Minneapolis. It's closed now, but at its height, it was said to be catering at least a dozen other locations around the metro area. During the summer of 2020, Safari Restaurant itself was a site for free food distribution. It was claimed to have been feeding 5,000 children per day, 2 meals per day, for an entire month every single day. The Safari network is said to have taken $15 million out of the free food programs, this according to the FBI. The S&S Catering Company claims to have served several thousand children per day out of this storefront on Lake Street, as well as catering a number of sites around the metro area. So this is the actual forfeiture lawsuit taped to the front door of the building. According to the FBI, figures associated with S&S Catering took $14 million out of the federal free food programs. This is the Empire Cuisine restaurant in Shakopee, near downtown Shakopee. This location, again, was said to be catering dozens of locations in the metro area. During the summer of 2020, this restaurant was also a free food distribution site, said to be serving several hundred children per day. The restaurant is still open and serving customers. It's one of the few sites named in the FBI search warrants that are still in operation. The figures associated with Empire Cuisine and Catering are said by the FBI to have taken $16 million out of the federal free food programs. The board of directors of Feeding Our Future voted to dissolve the company shortly after the scandal broke in early 2022. The company is now involved in a lawsuit with Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, who got involved in the case as he is the regulator of nonprofits within the state of Minnesota. The company is in the process of dissolving and distributing whatever money they have left over. Partners in Nutrition, doing business as Partners in Quality Care, was suspended by the Minnesota Department of Education when the scandal broke. But they have appealed their suspension and have won their appeal and are in the process of seeking reinstatement into the free food programs. Partners in Nutrition, although mentioned in the search warrants, was not one of the locations searched, and nobody associated with the company itself has been accused of fraud by the FBI. Youth Leadership Academy, Gargar Family Services, was actually suspended from the programs a month before the FBI raids. In fact, the company and its subsidiary nonprofits were not named in any of the FBI search warrants or by the U.S. Attorney in his lawsuit. The company has appealed its suspension and has won its first round and is seeking reinstatement to the free food programs. We've already shown a number of sites that were distribution locations for the free food programs, but in our travels around the metro area, we visited several others that seem very unlikely as mass distribution points for school children to receive free food. National New York Times reporter David Fahrenholt took an interest in this story and over the winter visited Minnesota and many of the locations involved in the free food scandal. In particular, he visited this location, the Central Avenue Lofts in Minneapolis, where he interviewed residents asking them whether they had seen thousands of school children being fed out of the second-floor apartment that was listed as a free food distribution site. Nobody had seen anything, of course. This is 1013 Cliff Road. It's an industrial site located not very far from Cliff End Park. It has no on-site parking, but it was said to be a distribution site for free food during the pandemic. This is 1506 South Cross. It's a storefront in a strip mall in Burnsville and was said to be a distribution site for free food. In fact, it's one of the locations that the FBI staked out during their investigation. They actually had agents across the street watching this location and reported nobody coming to receive free food. For her part, Amy Bach, the CEO of Feeding Our Future, claimed that distribution took place only for a few hours every Saturday and that the FBI agents must not have ever been there on a Saturday. It's in a location sandwiched between a child care facility and a gas station. There really isn't room for feeding 2,000 children per day, even on a Saturday. We visited two different locations on University Avenue in St. Paul. 1821 University Avenue is a large office complex with more than 500,000 square feet. A total of 10 locations claim to be operating 11 separate food distribution sites at this location, said to be capable of serving up to 11,000 children per day. It's an office building. There's no parking lot or facilities for serving 11,000 people per day. Just up the street is this location. 2434 University Avenue is a storefront not very far away, said to be serving thousands of children per day. It sits across from the light rail on a busy street, and there's no available parking. By now you're wondering, if the FBI is correct about the massive industrial-scale fraud involved, how did any of this happen? How did this escape the attention of regulators? Well, to get to the answer, you have to go back to the early days of the pandemic. In the early days of the pandemic, the thought was schools were going to shut down and be unable and unavailable to distribute food. So the feds thought they needed a parallel network of nonprofits to be able to distribute food to school children outside of the school setting. So they issued a number of waivers to the otherwise stringent rules governing the two free food programs. One of them was to allow private restaurants to distribute food. Now, this was available in the summer of 2020. Afterwards, restaurants weren't allowed to be distribution sites, but they could serve as caterers, as vendors to other nonprofits who distributed foods outside of restaurants. Another waiver issued by the U.S. Department of Agriculture involved on-site consumption. Under the original rules of the program, children had to consume meals at the location where they were distributed, whether the school or child care facility or whatever. The department issued a waiver allowing for off-site consumption. They could take meals to go, or families could receive bundled meals, 2 or 3 meals per day for an entire week, bagged up for them to take home for home consumption. The U.S. Department of Agriculture waived the requirement that the local regulator, in this case the Minnesota Department of Education, would visit a newly approved site during its first week of operation to make sure that it was following all of the rules of the program. In addition, an ongoing requirement for the regulators to visit a site on a 3-year rotating basis was waived. Again, the concern was having people visiting on site during COVID-19 was thought to be a way to spread the virus further. Another requirement that was dropped during the pandemic was for a site visit of all eligible locations every 3 years. The summer food service program was originally conceived to be summer only, during those months when school was out of session. It was extended into the fall and actually became a year-round program where sites could distribute food even while school was in session. And perhaps the biggest change, the eligibility requirements were dropped around low income. As originally conceived, these programs were available only to low-income families or in areas that were considered low-income areas. As a result of these waivers, all children were eligible everywhere. Beyond the changes made to the program during the pandemic, the story between Feeding Our Future, Partners in Nutrition, and the Department of Education actually goes back several years earlier. In 2016, Feeding Our Future and Partners in Nutrition were originally incorporated. They were actually incorporated by the same people, Apparently there was a falling out between the two camps later on, and Feeding Our Future spun off as its own operation. Partners in Nutrition was the first out of the gate, and they had trouble even getting admitted to the program. The Department of Education refused to process their application because they were a very different kind of entity. They weren't a school or a child care or a church facility. They were a purpose-built nonprofit created just for the purpose of accessing these federal programs and serving no other benefits to the community. The Department of Education wouldn't process the applications that Partners in Nutrition filed, so Partners sued the Department of Education, and the state court ruled that not only did they have to be admitted, but they had to have all of their applications approved. So when Feeding Our Future came along, they also had problems with the Department of Education. But they were able to join the program, get sites up and running, but continued to feud with the department over which locations could be open and how many children could be served. Things came to a head in October 2020 when the Department of Education unilaterally canceled 6 Feeding Our Future locations from program participation. The following month, Feeding Our Future sued the Department of Education. The lawsuit dragged on. The Department of Education escalated their efforts in March 2021, actually suspending Feeding Our Future from the program entirely and suspending payment of all of their invoices. Here's an interesting figure in the case. His name is Empress Malcolm Watson Jr. As it happens, he's the live-in boyfriend of Feeding Our Future CEO Amy Bach. And he was named in the FBI search warrants as having diverted Feeding Our Future money for his own use, involving Las Vegas junkets, luxury car rentals, and the like. When the scandal first broke, there were a number of videos available on social media involving the principals of this case. Many of these videos have been pulled from circulation, but a couple are still out there. Here's a video of Amy Bach receiving an award from the community. This video, which was originally put up by Powerline and also available elsewhere on social media, shows allegedly an employee of Feeding Our Future at her wedding reception. During the wedding reception, as you can see in the video, she received a wedding gift consisting of bars of gold. The donors of these bars of gold were said to be figures behind the Safari restaurant. The Feeding Our Future case also involves political angles. There were a number of prominent Minneapolis politicians who received donations from figures named in the case, individuals who were listed in either the FBI search warrants or in the U.S. Attorney's lawsuit. Among the politicians receiving donations, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, Jeremiah Ellison. He's a member of the Minneapolis City Council, and he happens to be the son of Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison. Prominent Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who represents Minneapolis and some of the surrounding suburbs, and a newly elected state senator. Each of these politicians received thousands of dollars in donations from figures named in the case. In some instances, donations were returned to the donors or forwarded on to other food-related nonprofits. Mayor Frey has another connection to this case. A senior aide of his, Abdi Salah, was named in a lawsuit having received money from Feeding Our Future and, along with a relative of his, used it to purchase a small apartment building in South Minneapolis. Salah was either fired or quit his job with the mayor, depending on who's telling the story. There were other figures named in the case who received appointments to prominent task forces and working groups, either at the city or state level. To be sure, there are legitimate sites within the Feeding Our Future network that did distribute food to needy children during the pandemic. There are 2 figures associated with the scandal who were arrested on passport-related charges. Mohammed Jama Ismail and Abdul Aziz Farah are co-owners of the Empire restaurant. During the FBI raids, each had their private homes searched, and each had their U.S. passport seized by the FBI. Each man then applied to the State Department for a replacement passport, not telling quite the whole story of why they needed a new passport. Each man booked passage to Kenya using their newly reissued passport as identification. Why Kenya? Well, as you recall, there was real estate purchased in that nation using ill-gotten proceeds from the Feeding Our Future scandal, according to the FBI. Ismail was arrested on the jetway at Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, about to board a flight to Amsterdam en route to Kenya, when he was seized by the FBI. Farah also purchased a ticket to Kenya, although he was a no-show for his flight. Later, in May, he turned himself in to the FBI. At last report, both men were in federal custody, charged with passport fraud. But we here at the Center of the American Experiment will continue to monitor the case and report any new developments.